Thanks very much, and thanks to the organisers for inviting us to come here and talk. It's great to have a whole suite of presentations that precede you that mostly tell you the jokes I'm about to tell, which is good, but also that they're well presented, well researched, and all keep to time. Well, I'm just going to put an end to all of that, and I'm going to talk about Namibia, offshore Namibia. And of course, starting at the beginning, you've got to take a supercontinent, crack it in half in the early Cretaceous, leave it for 120 million years and let stuff fall off into it. And that, in a nutshell, is the geology of the South African margin. The rest is kind of detail, but it's quite interesting detail, and especially when you come down to the hydrocarbon story for the Namibian margin. So the area that we're going to be talking about, or at least focusing on, is here down in the Orange Basin on the southern margin of West Africa. And the question I'd like to ask everybody is, why on earth would I need to establish a hydrocarbon case for the Orange River Basin? And the reason for that is that the general perception is most of the oil and gas that has been discovered in West Africa has been discovered in the salt basins, and they're further north, and effectively north of the Walvis Ridge here, in the Santos Campos basins, and in the Kwanza and up in Congo and Gabon basins. And these are all salt basins. So the question that we've got to address is there something fundamental about the presence of salt that has led to the generation of, well, the presence of a source rock and the generation of oil and then the entrapment of oil? So the question is it fundamental to hydrocarbon plays in this southern area here? Because if it is, we're kind of screwed, because there's no salt down here. The edge of the salt basin is very clearly delimited here, and there's a good reason for that, and we'll come on and have a look at why the salt is where it is and why it isn't where it isn't. And the fact that it doesn't actually make any difference is going to be the conclusion of all this. The Namibian work that we've got is based on some seismic that we've been acquiring, new seismic we've been acquiring over the last year or so, and we've acquired a data set of about 16,000 line kilometres of 2D data across the Orange River Basin Delta, which is here, and across and up into Luderitz and up towards the Walvis Ridge, never quite getting to the Walvis Ridge. In terms of this data set, it's all processed and ready for people to look at, except for this area down here, which is a seismic survey that we're currently acquiring at the moment on the South African side of the Orange Basin. And that's an operation that's ongoing right now. So Namibia, as David just said, it's a very underexplored basin. It's ridiculous. It's nearly 500,000 square kilometres of shelf edge with 16 wells on it, 7 of which are in Kudu. For goodness sake, it's amazing. So this is the opportunity. This is why it's an interesting place to go and explore. And the question is, that can we put together hydrocarbon play systems that will be interesting for the industry to go and explore? The first thing everybody knows about Namibia is that there's no source rock. Well, that's kind of a bit embarrassing, because we've got a 1.5 TCF gas field stuck in the middle of it, and just across the border in South Africa we've got oil discoveries. So clearly there is a source rock, but what's the source rock story? And then the next thing everybody knows is that there's no reservoirs. Well, that's not true either, because we've got the Kudu gas field, but almost every well has found sands at some stratigraphic level or another. And as soon as you look at the seismic, you just see so much sand. It's incredible. A child can find sand here. So there's actually no problem, as I hope to demonstrate, with source rock or reservoir. So clearly the big problem with this area, this margin, is that there's no structures. Oh, come on, let's go and have a look at some seismic. Let's see if we can see some plays and some trapping mechanisms. This line, the top line here, is a super squash line. It's 300 kilometres long, so everything looks really, really steep. But it allows you to capture the essence of what a west-east line across the Orange River Basin would look like. And across here, to the eastern side, we have the synrift and pre-rift section with a series of rift grabens, which is one hydrocarbon play that has been chased in the past, and that's really all that had been chased in the Luderitz Basin and in the early days of the Orange Basin. And then as we come offshore, we've got some key sort of structural things we've got to get our eyes into. We've got this area here where the pre-rift is relatively high, and this is known as the hinge zone. I don't suppose it does actually hinge, but it's known as the hinge zone, and this is this area here. And as we come off the way towards what's known as the outer high area, we see these incredible cliniforms, or prograding cliniforms that are dipping out in the section just here. Well, that would be good, except they're neither prograding nor cliniforms. These are the well-known SDRs, which you see on just about every passive margin in the world. There are a few exceptions to that. And SDRs means seaward dipping reflector. And you just see a lot of them. Not really well understood exactly what they are, and I'm going to propose an idea about what they are and how they can help us understand the margin, understand the development of the South Atlantic Basin and its play systems in a wee while. On this margin, the potential source rocks are down here in the rift basins, in these rift grabens, in the synrift section. They're in amongst the SDRs, in amongst the seaward dipping reflectors in that late synrift section. And then there's two post breakup unconformity. The breakup unconformity is this guy across here. There are two potential reservoirs. There's an Albion reservoir. What am I talking about? Two potential source rocks in the post breakup unconformity section. There's an Albion source rock, and then there's a Cenomanian Turonian source rock. We've done some gravity modelling with Archex, who put together this review of the gravity and the structure of this margin. It was really done just to demonstrate what everybody knew about the margin, and of course it's come up with results that don't actually quite fit with what everybody knew about the margin. So it's quite an interesting process in itself. But in essence, here's the coast of Namibia running down here to the Orange Basin, down in this area here. And we've got a relatively high gravity ridge, which is the hinge zone where the pre-rift is basically coming up in the section. And behind it, in the synrift grabens, we've got a below gravity section, which runs just about along the whole coast. And then as we come outboard, where we come to the outboard highs, remember those seaward dipping reflectors making an outboard high, there's again another gravity low. So that's really quite interesting, because if those seaward dipping reflectors are comprised of basalts, then we shouldn't get a gravity low as we come off the hinge zone. We should actually get a gravity high. That's not what we see, and that is kind of rubbing against the conventional wisdom of what this section comprises. So if we look at that in just a little bit more detail, this is the hinge zone running through here. Actually, before I go off that section, can I just say that the original play that was explored on this margin was in these early synrift grabens, quite close to the coast, because it's in shallow water and relatively easy to drill. And of course, that was the only place anybody could explore. What's interesting is that this play runs all the way along that margin. There's no reason to just fuss about in the Orange River Delta for that play. You can look at that play right the way along that margin, and it's pretty much unexplored except for a few wells drilled in the 60s and 70s on rather ropey old data. Maybe something to put in your mind for the future. But here we have, again, just to reiterate, we've got the synrift grabens towards the coast. We've got the hinge zone here where the pre-rift section, the Precambrian, comes quite high in the section, and coming off that, where the SDRs, the seaward dipping reflectors, make the outer high, we have a gravity low. And that's not what people expected, certainly not what I expected. This is the classic model for the margin in terms of its gravity, and it has this really dense section in the outboard section. When we match it to the data, well, in ArcX, I'll not steal the credit for any of this, but when ArcX match it against the data that we've got, we don't see any evidence for a dense underplating section, and in fact the only way we match the data is to make the SDRs lower density than basalt. So whatever the SDRs are, the seaward dipping reflectors are, they're not just basalt. There may be a lot of basalt, but they're not just basalt. And so what exactly are they? We're going to look at the SDRs in a minute. Let's just look at a piece of seismic over the Sinrift Graben area. In these areas now, in order to think about what the Sinrift was like at the time of deposition, it's just really easy. Just think the East African Rift. You think Lake Albert. You think of narrow grabens, relatively deep water lakes. At the bottom of these lakes, they can be anoxic. They can be an excellent place for depositing source rocks and preserving those source rocks. So you get the source rocks in the order of 3 to 20% total organic carbon is what you could expect in this play back here. And because they're not hugely deeply buried by the subsequent Cretaceous and Tertiary section, they're still in the oil window. So you've actually got in these little half grabens here, these Sinrift half grabens, you've got an oil play quite close to the coast in relatively shallow water. Oh, where in the world can you find those that haven't been just explored to death? Nowhere. This is really quite a unique type of situation, and it's something that the oil industries should get after, in my humble opinion. So this is part of the section in here, the early part of the Sinrift, forming as Gondwana is breaking up, just as the East African Rift is forming now. Think East African Rift and you'll understand the geometry and the depositional sequences you can expect to find within that Sinrift graben. Now, in the late Sinrift, things change a bit here. We get the appearance of a lot more basalts, and the play that we're going to look at, not so much on this piece of rather fuzzy seismic, but the next play we're going to look at, on the next slide, the play we're going to look at is the Kudu play. And the interesting thing about the Kudu play, as we've heard before, is that it is in this part of the section here. It's below the breakup unconformity, which is very clearly seen through here. And it's this early Cretaceous sequence. Now, in the Kudu section, you've got basalts and you've got Aeolian dunes. That's really quite an interesting combination, because what that's telling you is that these are subaerial basalts. In fact, they're flood basalts. And these flood basalts are effectively the way to understand the SDRs is that this is a flood basalt section that is unlapping onto the continent as the rifting occurs. So there's one more point. I'll just make a simple point on this seismic line before we go off it. This is a time section. It's running west to east and again about 200 kilometres long across the Orange River Delta here. So this is in time. And you may be wondering why these SDRs here, the seaward dipping reflectors in here, why are we talking about that as an outer high? And the reason that is the outer high is that although in time it's the outer slope, in depth, when you convert it to depth, it's a high. And it creates these high features here. So actually, as you come outboard offshore Namibia, there's a whole ridge that runs offshore Namibia, running from the north to the south of this outer high, these seaward dipping reflectors that are in effectively four-way dip closures. Really, really interesting, provided you could be confident that you could find some sands and some source in there. Well, effectively, that's essentially what the Kudu play is. It's sands, Aeolian dune sands, in between flood basalts. And so in here, there's a whole series of plays that could be chased of that style, running right the way up the coast. So, well, I'm going to explain what these SDRs are first, and then hopefully you'll figure out why I'm bothering talking about them. The SDRs, as the rift opens, you get these large flood basalt complexes. Well, you do here because this is all subaerial. If this area was inundated by marine incursion, you wouldn't get flood basalts, you get mid-ocean ridge basalts, because basically the basalts come up out of the vent and they just quench. So you don't get flood basalts. If you can do it in a subaerial sense, you can get large lava flows that are maybe 10 foot, 3 meters thick, that can run over huge areas. And that seems to be what happened in the margin offshore Namibia at the end of the Ammonium. So you have these volcanic events, lots of these flood basalts come out, and they are deposited over a large area. In between the volcanic events, you've got time for lakes to form, which can be restricted, and therefore you can get source rocks deposited and captured. And similarly, you can get reservoirs deposited and the Kudu type sands that get deposited as dune fields that just roll across these flood basalts in between the periods of volcanicity. And then the flood basalts, because the Atlantic keeps opening, these flood basalts keep sinking, and they sink, and that's what generates that geography or the geometry that you see on the seismic line. That's the dipping reflectors, and a whole lot of other flood basalts come onto it. So you appear to have this onlapping, they appear to look like prograde inclinoforms, but they're not at all. The system works the other way. They're actually onlapping lava flows onto dipping reflectors. And so in the early part of the opening of the rift, we're thinking East African Rift, there are areas that get isolated, isolated rifts, isolated grabens and lakes, and in some of those, provided you can get a source of salt into them, some of these lakes become isolated and you deposit, actually they're quite big lakes, but so you can deposit thick salts. Now everybody knows that the seawater that provides the marine incursions, that provides the salt basins in the Santos Campos and in the Kwanzaa and Gabon basins, everybody knows that that seawater comes from the south and goes north. Well, just at this very moment in time here, we know it's subaerial deposition. So where does that seawater come from? It's kind of an interesting point, isn't it? Because everybody, well, I certainly think that as the two continents open, so marine incursion comes from the south and it just opens up the basin coming from south to north. But at the same time as we're depositing salts in the basins here, we're depositing subaerial deposits over a large flood basalt domain right in the way of it, just down here. So that's kind of a bit of a problem with that whole model. And it might suggest that we need to seek some other solutions for where the marine incursions come from that create these salt basins back here. But before I wig you out completely with my mad ideas, let's get back to sort of standard thinking. Here we are in the late Ammonium. We've got the rift basin opening here, large flood basalts piling out and creating the seaward dipping reflectors that we see in Namibia and right up the margin. And you also see these same seaward dipping reflectors if you go across to the Pelotas Basin or to Uruguay on the other side. You see the same seaward dipping reflectors because it's the same process of the sea opening. So what happens then is that we get a marine incursion. Basically, the whole lot is so stuffed full of big, heavy basalts, it starts to sink and you get a marine incursion. And this does happen in the late Ammonium. And when you get a marine incursion, instead of depositing flood basalts, you deposit mid-ocean ridge, moor type ocean floor basalts. And so these basalts are just basically deposited at the vent, whereas these basalts are deposited over large regions. And you can tell exactly when that marine incursion occurred because it peneplanes the surface over the previous flood basalts. And this is a ubiquitous feature, and it's really, really interesting, and I think it will come on when I get right to the end of the talk. We'll talk about a play that relates to this. This characteristic peneplaned surface that comes up to the edge of the outer high. And as I say, you can not only see this in Namibia, you can go to the Pelotas Basin or Uruguay and you can see the same thing. He's looking for these seaward dipping reflectors here in Uruguay You see them in Namibia. And so what I've done here is I've taken seismic lines that we've got off Namibia and taken them from Uruguay, reconstructed the plates back to 110 million years, and slapped the two seismic lines together. Completely ridiculous thing to do, by the way, but it's kind of fun because what it does is it gives you a feel for the size of the basin at the time of 110 million years, and bear in mind that this is like 200 kilometres of seismic that we're looking at. And also it gives you an idea of what might happen next. And what happens next in the Aptin and then in the Albion is that the whole basin starts to sag, and then we fill it up with stuff that's fallen off Africa or fallen off South America. And it's interesting, the concept that some of the turbidites that come off South America at the time of this original marine transgression into a deep basin setting, they could start off coming off Brazil and end up onlapping onto the outer high in Namibia. And of course now the continents are separated. The source of those turbidites is, a long, long way away. So it's kind of a bit surprising conclusion, but it's quite useful because if you can get a turbidite here to onlap up against this outer high, at the down dip termination of your turbidite is now pointing up dip, and it's a perfect situation to get a trapping scenario, which is kind of a bit of a funky way to look at finding turbidite traps in this deeper outer basin area. Anyway, let's moving on. Moving back to Namibia, we're now going to go from the pre-breakup unconformity sequence and then start looking at some of the plays in the post-breakup unconformity sequence. Now there's quite a well-established, in Namibia, there's quite well-established evidence for an Albion source rock in this area here, and it's established from well data, total organic carbon from the Albion section offshore Namibia. And even the USGS kind of twigged this one, and so that they mysteriously generated an anoxic basin south of the Walvis Ridge at the time of the Albion. So reasonable agreement that we should find an anoxic basin, a marine source rock at the time of the Albion. This reconstruction was done by the University of Houston for us. It's really interesting work because I hadn't really thought about it, but they kind of leave the Falklands on the on this process, and it looks like it actually makes this quite a restricted basin in the Albion. So that maybe is a reason why that is a source rock that could be identified in that area here. So that's the Albion source rock. The USGS kind of blow it then because they open this whole area up in the Cenomanian Turonian, and it just looks like a big open marine basin. There's no chance of finding any source rock in that area. But unfortunately, the wells kind of know better, and there's a couple of wells drilled in Namibia which have reasonable total organic contacts, quite high within the Cenomanian Turonian section. And also, much to everybody's maybe surprise and joy, the recent well drilled by Petrobras and Chariot just north of Kudu found a mature Cenomanian Turonian source rock. So again, a good evidence for a source rock. So we've got quite well-established evidence for an Albion source rock and also for a Cenomanian source rock. I'm not feeling any big pain about the source rock at this point, but we did some modelling, and we looked at Albion source rock and Cenomanian source rock in 3 settings across the Orange Delta. Firstly, across to the east towards the coast, where the section is relatively thin, the Cretaceous section is relatively thin, and what we found, I'll show you the results of what we found in a minute, but we did some modelling on these 2 source rocks in this setting, and we did some more modelling on setting around the area just to the west of the hinge zone, and then looked at the section that's right out in the deep water sitting over that outer high. Again, looking at the Albion and the Cenomanian source rocks, marine source rocks, present across the whole area. And in each of these areas, you get a slightly different result. In the centre area, because burial is a lot deeper, then this source rock, certainly the Albion source rock, is mature for gas. Whereas as you come to the either to the west or to the east, in the deep water and the shallow water, the source rocks are mature for oil. This is a pretty old story, and this was some work that was published years and years ago, basically showing the same sort of conclusions. So we have two source rocks here, an Albion type of source rock, which is slightly deeper. So we have gas in the middle of the delta, and we have oil in the nearboard and in the deep water setting. And then you look for the sedimentary source rock, you've got the same story, and in the middle you've got gas mature source rock, and then you've got oil mature on either side of that. So the story, it seems quite straightforward really. You've got an oil source rock that's mature, generating oil in the nearboard section, where you've got at least 3, probably 4 different source rocks to choose from. In the centre, where you've got the Kudu field, you actually would predict you would find gas, and that's exactly what you do find. The really interesting bit is when you go offshore and you go into the deep water, you've got several oil source rocks that are mature for generating oil, and it's totally unexplored. So source rocks, don't worry about that. Next thing is reservoir. Is there any hope of finding any sand in the Orange Basin? We just drilled a well, the BP Chariot well, didn't find any sand. Oh, there's no sand in the whole basin. Well, it's a load of rubbish. There's tons of sand in this basin. You can see it on the seismic. You just got to drill in the right place. And just to illustrate this, we saw that great talk by T-Tech before, which did this in a lot more detail. But if you just take the drainage basin for the Orange River today in South Africa, it's most of South Africa is draining into the Orange Basin, and as the presentation showed, that's largely been the case for a long, long period of time. And that's why the Orange River Basin is so big, and big plastic delta. You cannot erode all these granitic mountains without producing sand, which you'll then dump into the Orange River Basin, and you've just got to drill your wells and find them. So if you take that section that we started off with across the Orange River Delta, you go from the near shore to the deep water. Can we think of any trapping mechanisms, any structures in that whole region? Well, I do hope so. Just had a quick look, and I could think of, 20 odd without, that's on one seismic line. When you've got the full data set and you start to look at the quality of the data, you can pick out the traps, pick out the stratigraphic plays, and start to find a whole range of different hydrocarbon traps. I'm going to show you some of them that really excited me. This one I quite liked. Oh, see it on here. It would be located in this type of setting in here. And so what we've got is the whole set of imbricated toe thrusts coming off in the Cretaceous section, slumping off into the basin. It looks a bit weird here. I'm slightly puzzled as to why we get these imbricated toe thrusts in the middle of this delta. Why didn't it just keep on trucking as it slid all the way down into the Atlantic? And the reason is because this is a time section, and when you convert this into depth, this section here that's slumping, it's a massive, massive slump in the Cretaceous. It's slumping against a high. So if you can imagine when you jump into the bath and you slump down into it, the water kind of has a problem with the far end of your bath. This is the same thing that's happening here. These sediments are slumping against a high. They're being prevented from slumping any further, and so they're having to lose the space contraction by generating a series of imbricate toe thrusts. Kind of nice, because they're all counter-regional dipping structures that you could map out as individual structures. And right at the end of it is my favourite one, really, is the section where you have the sands that are not involved in the imbricate toe thrust that are butting against the first of the imbricate toe thrusts. And it's a rather wonderful feature, which you can see running down here, a nice bright event. So that's probably one of the more dramatic parts of the structuring. But if we go away from the imbricate toe thrust up into the gravity slides further up dip, you see these very big rollers here creating counter-regional dip. There is no problem finding structure in this region. Question is, can we see the sands? Can you see them on the seismic? You see these little blips here. You can map these things around. And these are sand channels that are worming their way down the slope as the delta progrades. So plenty of evidence for really good anastomosing sand channels. What you want to clearly do is target those with your well and not drill the highs that are in between, because they might be bold, and I suspect that's probably what has been done to date. Even on this section you can see a whole series of other plays and stratigraphic traps against slumps further up on this section. So, it's just a great basin. It's completely unexplored, it's full of sand, full of source rock, it's mature, and it's just waiting for people to get out there and drill some wells. So a couple more examples of these anastomosing sand channels. I don't know what else that can be, but it's sand. There is no problem with reservoir in the Orange River Basin. Now, my last parting gesture really on the play front is it's kind of the oddest thing that came out of some data that we acquired last year. We extended a few of the lines just to see what the seismic looked like as you went out onto oceanic crust. So this is, again, one of these massive long lines. It's about 350 kilometres long, and it goes from the Orange River Delta out here, across the SDRs and the outboard high time section, so it doesn't look too high, and comes down the slope, and then we come out into the mid-ocean ridge type, more type basalt there. And the question was, well, where does continental crust stop? Where does oceanic crust start? What's transitional crust actually mean? I don't think anybody really wants to tell me the answers to that question. And it's well, what was interesting is that that's when we first saw this thing here, this outboard high, this fault or a cliff edge, and that's nearly a kilometre high at the edge of the outboard high. And then we thought, well, what might be infilling that? Most likely thing to infill that is some late Aptian, early Albion source rock. When we did the modelling, the basin modelling, it looks like it's been buried deep enough to be oil mature. So then all you need to do is to run your turbidites either from, contentiously, from the Platus Basin. You run them across the basin and on-lap them up against the outboard high, or perhaps even a bit more reasonably, you bring your sands from the Orange River Basin and you dump them down in the basin. So then you've got a mature source rock with turbidite sitting on top of it, and chasing those plays is the future of the deep water exploration in this region. So just to really promise you, finally conclude, what we got is 1,600 kilometres of new data in here, infilled by reprocessed and old data. We're acquiring new data as we speak on the South African side, and what we conclude is that the area is very exciting, very underexplored. We've got huge amounts of evidence for source rocks and reservoir and traps and structure. We can see it on the seismic, we can chase the plays on the seismic, and there's absolutely no need to be worried about the fact that it's not a salt basin here. This is truly a world-class oil basin just waiting to be explored in the right place. Thank you very much.
Any questions for Neil? What do you think it is that leads people, explorers? Well, it's sort of two questions. One is, you can observe from behaviour that explorers, and I've used this analogy before, are like a bunch of 8-year-old children playing football, that they all pursue the ball, and if you look down at the pitch, there's 2 goalkeepers and 20 others all round the ball. And you can look at West Africa or deep water today and say that happens. But what's the flip side of that leads everybody to say there's absolutely nothing down here? Is it just ignorance or lack of imagination?
I kind of know what you mean in terms of the sort of herd mentality, but there's enough sort of maverick people in the oil industry that wants the herd to go in other ways to get over that problem. And I think what can happen is you can just drill a few wells and get unlucky. You're either not drilling on seismic with the right technology, so you can't see the plays, or it's too early a stage in the basin development, so people don't key in on the key play elements early enough. And then you have a few wells, and it can just turn everybody off. And there's plenty of oil and gas being found around the world. We shouldn't beat ourselves up and think that we're totally herd-minded people that don't have any original thought. But some places get attended to first, and some places get attended to later. One of the interesting things about Namibia is that we're now moving into the deep water offshore. And it was only 10 years ago, if you wanted to drill a well in over 400 metres of water, most exploration managers would probably get clipped round the ear hole and told not to be so silly. But now, of course, we can look in deep waters and we can start to think, 2 kilometres of water, that's not a daft place to look for oil and gas, and that will cause a resurgence of activity and a resurgence of exploration energy in the basin's world. If you think of the amount of the world's continental shelves that have been opened up due to the technology transfer over the last 10 years, it's ridiculous. We've maybe quadrupled the amount of continental shelf that we can have a crack at. And Namibia is going to be like that. People are going to be drawn to Namibia, find the next new plays there, and then, of course, everybody will have always liked it, and the herd will follow. But it just takes that one little bit of good luck to get it going.
Yeah. Good, okay. I was just trying, Peter Ratty, how many wells did industry drill on the western margin of the UK before Foynehaven and the Schiehallion were discovered? 50?
Yeah.
50 odd? That sort of number, yeah.
I think, Dave, one of the biggest challenges I think these plays face is reservoir quality. It's well PI. It's whether a well can produce 40 to 100,000 barrels of oil equivalent a day. That's the key to the commercial viability of these water depths, not actually trap size.
You're quite right, Peter. You're quite right, Peter. We can certainly always find something to worry about. But when you look at the seismic and you follow those sand channels down there, you know that those sand channels are stuffed full of sand. We're going to find hundreds of metres of sand. That's not a problem. They've not been buried particularly deeply. Yes, they're Cretaceous, so they're not the youngest of. They're not like Pliocene or something. They've not been buried particularly deeply. Maybe something could have gone wrong. The heat flow isn't high enough to have filled it full of silica. It should be all right. And it's one of these risk-based things. And until somebody goes and drills one of those sand channels, finds 200 metres of sand, it's 25% porosity, then of course it'll all be obvious. But until that happens, yes, it's one of those concerns. And as I said right at the beginning, everybody knows that there's no source rock in Namibia, there's no reservoirs, and there's no structures. But when a company goes in, makes that big discovery, you can bet the herd will follow.
Please.
It seems a bit odd that there's so much activity going on in Angola, for instance.
Yes.
And why? What's the reason for that?
Well, as you go into Angola, north of the Walvis Ridge, you come into a salt basin. And in some respects, things get harder because you've got the salt to deal with and your seismic looks, it can be pretty awful. But in Angola, it all sort of started with that post-salt section, and then eventually people have got around to the idea of trying to look in the pre-salt section. But Angola had a good kickstart, if you will, by finding oil early within the salt basin. And oil companies and exploration managers, me included, kind of said, well, let's stick to the salt basin because we know it works. And you go south of the Walvis Ridge, it's like, oh, well, there's no source rock, there's no reservoir, there's no structure. And of course, that's kind of what happened with the industry. So Angola, yeah, there's a lot of oil being found there, but there are a lot of wells being drilled. In the whole of Namibia, you've got 16 wells drilled. 16 wells is nothing in a 500,000 square kilometres of continental shelf. So it's all to come for Namibia, I think.
That's a good thought, a good point, and we'll leave it. Thank you very much, Neil.